It's no secret how much I love the MacVenture point-and-click games, and you're probably pretty sick of me talking about them at this point. I've already mentioned how Deja Vu is probably my favorite of the whole bunch, but there's really no contention that 1987's Shadowgate is probably the most popular among them. With less of a focus on solving a crime and more on a grand world-saving adventure by advancing through an evil castle riddled with traps, goblins, and a general desire to kill the player, Shadowgate drew players in with its intricate and oftentimes frustrating puzzles and creepy atmosphere. Like the other MacVentures, sans the sequel to Deja Vu, Shadowgate saw a release on the Nintendo Entertainment System, where it arguably gained the most popularity. I've already talked about the Game Boy Color port of the NES version of Shadowgate, which is actually not as good to me as the NES version. Shadowgate also got a couple of sequels with different playstyles during the course of the 90s, Beyond Shadowgate and Shadowgate 64. While both of these were decent adventure games at heart with a focus on puzzle solving, these games did not see the kind of success the original had. Even after trying to expand the world and lore and overall appeal of Shadowgate, these sequels and the version on the Game Boy Color would be the last we heard of the Castle Shadowgate for a pretty long time. That is, until a crowdfunding effort began on Kickstarter.com to fund a remake of Shadowgate. Driven by the original creators of the game, the idea of a reimagined Shadowgate, a modern retelling of the definitive adventure game for many, was appealing. The Kickstarter effort surpassed its goal in 2012 with almost 3,500 people donating to the project. And the result is this: Shadowgate, as you've never seen it before. Beautifully recreated, the remake of Shadowgate is huge. The original versions of the game were always able to capture the tone and atmosphere of the individual rooms, but the limited palette and space on the screen forced some creative restrictions. Not so in this version. The gorgeous artwork with elements and assets appearing to be a sort of living painting really helps set Shadowgate apart from other modern adventure games. Items you can pick up and objects to interact with don't stick out because they're actually just sprites on top of a background layer like the NES version. They actually seem like they're part of the living painting that is before us. It all lends itself amazingly well to the tone crafted for this remake. Clearly, the amount of work that had to go into making each room of this castle look this good had to have been huge. Shadowgate begins by axing the idea of dropping the player off at the castle doors and instead includes a gorgeous opening cutscene. This helps establish the backstory, location, and overall majesty of the world of Shadowgate, something we only got to see touched on in previous entries in the series. Young Jer, who we only knew as a descendant of Hero Kings in the original versions of the game, is given a little bit more importance through the events of these cutscenes. This helps motivate players with finding and assisting the great wizard Lakmir, who appeared to Jer in a dream to give him the quest of seeking out Shadowgate, and ultimately the goal of stopping the Warlock Lord Talamar the Black from finding and reviving a great evil in the depths of the castle Shadowgate. The general gameplay is very similar to the original computer versions of Shadowgate. A list of commands show the various actions Jer can make. Some are used more than others, but fans of MacVentures know how fun it is to make the characters taste weird things or use certain objects on items they clearly don't belong with, just to experience some of the clever writing. Shadowgate is largely focused on solving puzzles with clever use of items you can discover within the castle. Certain things actually kind of make sense, such as using a dirk to cut a vine or breaking things with a hammer. Others, such as what tool or spell you might need to defeat a goblin or find a certain key or something like that, may be less obvious if you haven't found the right tool for the job, and that will usually leave you trying everything at your disposal to find a solution in a desperate attempt to make something work. This has always been a complaint that people have had with adventure games, especially games like Shadowgate. The try everything on everything approach is kind of boring for a lot of people, but for people like me, it's kind of enjoyable. And maybe that's just because we're used to the abuse, if you will. It is hard to say that the interface for this version of Shadowgate is pleasant. It works, yeah, but some of it can be a little frustrating, with accidentally clicking things out of order or canceling a command. The function overall is just like the old game, so it's fairly easy to get used to, but newcomers may get a little irked early on. Thankfully, you can bind commands to your keyboard and hide the interface for an immersive look at the gorgeous artwork the game features, which is really nice to have included. After a while, this became my preferred way to play, and you can always set the keys to whatever buttons you like. Jer's quest to stop the Warlock Lord is epic and grand, and certainly not without challenges. Some puzzles, as I mentioned, just make sense. Others will require a little bit more thinking and, frankly, just trial and error, unlike the lateral thinking found in games like Deja Vu. Knowing what items that you should take and where to put certain things, or walking into rooms only to get killed because you lack a shield or something, are common types of puzzles and situations in Shadowgate. But getting past these and solving these puzzles typically leaves a great sense of accomplishment with the player, and since the entirety of the Castle Shadowgate is really one huge puzzle waiting to be solved, progressing to a new area always feels like a huge step forward in your quest. This is rather unlike Deja Vu and Uninvited, where most of the game's areas are largely easily accessible early on. Of course, the torches are still as prevalent as they were in the original version of Shadowgate, forcing a sort of time limit on gameplay. An extinguished torch will spell doom for the player, and the fact that the room gets noticeably darker as the torch's flame dies is a nice touch. However, the new version here adds something the NES version only implied. A Banshee's curse will be set on Jared during the course of his adventure pretty early on, and eventually will kill him if a cure isn't found. The effects of the curse worsen over time, eventually leading toward the inability to proceed further in the game without dying immediately. Now this happened to me twice, and I merely restarted my adventure. The effects of the curse and the game's writing help create a greater sense of urgency that even the dimming of the torchlight was unable to make. And despite the setback of being forced to restart in order to find the cure quicker, I enjoyed this aspect of the game. I went into this remake of Shadowgate expecting old school hard, and I got it. The castle wants the player dead, and expecting that challenge is something players need to be ready for. Despite that, however, the game does include several difficulty settings and a tutorial for play. Now, while the core puzzles stay relatively the same, the difference is in the difficulty and the amount of puzzles and rooms you'll experience, and many of the puzzles working almost completely differently between each setting. The Banshee's curse will also worsen at a quicker rate in the more difficult settings as well, and the cure will be harder to obtain, whereas the cure is ready-made and easily found in the easiest setting. This adds a great amount of replay value in my mind, since some rooms are plain inaccessible in the easier settings, but necessary in the harder ones. Being a pro with the original versions of Shadowgate can actually lead you down a path with no solution. Shadowgate recognizes that the majority of fans for the game come from the NES, where the game saw huge success as the first MacVenture released on the platform. In this remake, you can turn on certain aspects of retro mode, with the description text appearing to be written with a quill like the NES version, the full NES background score, or even the screen transitions from that version of the game. These are fun and can be turned on or off individually at any time. I think the most recognizable thing about Shadowgate are the ways to die, and it's arguably the most fun element of the game as well. Like I mentioned before, this castle wants you dead, and hunting down all the different ways to end Jared's life can be rather amusing. But understandably, it gets old fast when trying to solve certain puzzles that result in death, since you'll have to go back to the title screen and resume your game at a very slow process. The monsters attacking you are sufficiently frightening, and the writing to describe each of the deaths is deliciously violent and captivating, something that's always been appealing about the MacVenture games. Aside from the slightly clunky interface, the length of the game is another big drawback for Shadowgate. And you might be saying, but the game's been expanded. Well, it has, but it's still kind of short. Depending on the difficulty you choose at the beginning of the game, some puzzles and rooms are just plain missing too. And while going to higher difficulties adds a little bit of that replay value with more rooms and puzzles not present in the easier settings, the main story can be cleared very quickly depending on the skill of the player. When you look at games like Shadowgate, I think we're starting to see a sort of renaissance with the point-and-click genre. More and more point-and-click games are being released, and a lot of them are being crowdfunded no less. Shadowgate's remake has done an excellent job of appealing to the retro-minded fans, but also, with the addition of easier difficulties, lowering the perceived barrier of entry to point-and-click games. Shadowgate is, rather frankly, not a game for everyone, and some may say that it is the fault of the game's style being out of date. I disagree. While the UI hiccups are cumbersome and getting used to it is hardly a good excuse, they are hardly a deal breaker for the enjoyment of a title such as this. With expanded puzzles and rooms brand new to the game, a gorgeous art style, an expanded story that adds a great sense of urgency and a plot actually worth caring about, the remake of Shadowgate proves that these games are still interesting and relevant to many players, and proves that they can still be done well and crafted with love for the product. If you're a fan of first-person adventure games like the MacVenture series, you're probably already aware of the Shadowgate remake. You may have even backed it. However, I think this is a game that actually surpasses its original. This is one remake that takes everything that made the original so great and only multiplies it by a huge amount to make it an even better, more full experience. This is simply one adventure game that is great for retro fans as well as new casual adventurers alike.
Just as you release a sigh of relief, the Woovern twists, turning your world upside down. You lose your grip on the beast and tumble from the saddle into the nothingness below. As you plummet to certain death, you ponder everything that went wrong and how you might do it differently given another chance. You have found a hidden death. 'Tis a sad thing that your adventures have ended here.